Penguin has joined the Fae. Cool. Well then, go wire 5,000. Now you go to notifications. Ouch. Da 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 da. Dink. I heard one thing pop up. I'm not hearing myself speaking though. Oh, well, now I do. Isn't that wonderful? Dividing. And have not gotten the Twitter post. Stream elements, you are so behind. No time's gotta click that button. Doop. 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 Oh, I forgot when I got a viewer. Here's Zealand. Okay. Says all the bots are here. I haven't seen any bots, but I'm really looking for bots. I will post that myself. Notifications. Yep. Oh. Close that. Guess I will queue in. Hey, look! Stream is starting soon. Coming soon to a stream near you. Not that you'll come in, but hey. Just because I'm on and entertaining myself doesn't mean I have to entertain other people. What? Strike that, reverse it. Oop, that's not what I want. I believe it gave me the weird thing. Sure, copy all. Okay. Country road, take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, not my mind. Take me home. Country road. Nope, do not want to post that again. I'm just going to copy it. Thank you. And do not need to save that. Okay. I'm going to close that again and post all these to the random amounts of discords that I do. Okay, I'm on the switch now. Self-promotion. Just put it up here. Self-promotion. Paste it. And who else do I want to promote myself to? Go up here. VTuber Zone. It's there. So I'll go back to my own server and stare at myself needlessly. Video. Not that I need to turn on my camera for my own chat. Oh, my head is missing. That's not good. Where's my head gone? No video. Okay. Doo-doo. Of course, no one can see me on the screen anyway, because I'm invisible. Yo! There I am. Okay, well, let's hop over just chatting, shall we? There we go. Yeah, and my mouth doesn't move enough for it to really pick it up, which is just all sorts of screwiness. Let's see, we're only at 6 minutes, so we are going to go back into the Echoes of the Southland. I guess I need to change that to Echoes. O's, duh. And there's not a rerun, so I don't need to change that. Okay. So, how's everyone's week been? Anyone? Oh, damn. Excuse me. 6 Flags Magic. Am I on auto? I guess I must be. Okay, well. Did more Echoes of the Southland. I do have to warn you that, there's, racial language. This is a book from the 40s. Well, my copy is from the 40s of a book from the turn of the century, and it's got, Civil War period writing in it, so. Ugh. Oh no, the slugma escaped it. I wonder if I need to adjust the sensitivity of my mouth. Yeah. I don't know. Doing Sweet Home Alabama. Oop. Oh, that's our work. Yep. And Cub's gonna stream. We'll play some Control Cool. Big wheel keep on turning. Take me home to see my kin. Nope, got 2 viewers now. Or do I? There is someone lurking. As long as it's not a Mimikyu, I'm fine. I was watching some weird live-action Pokemon videos the other night. There was one that featured a Mimikyu in someone's house, and I can't remember what the doll Pokemon is. But they had to rescue the people in the house. It was kind of cool. And I don't know where I would look for live-action Pokemon. But it was like a Mimikyu was very angry at the people in the house. And they did a good job making sure no one could see it because it was just masked in a black cloud. And I knew exactly what it was as soon as I saw the arms reaching out and smacking people, so I'd at least go into a costume or something. Why do I have a little... Oh, okay, that's part of the artwork. Let's see... Let's just see what it sounds like.
Hello there.
Oh, didn't hear it. Maybe. Text to speech. Oh, cool. Oh, that's interesting. Not nearly as good as mine.
I got a bad feeling about this.
And this one is... me coughing a lot. Nothing to have a bad feeling about. Unless you get traumatized by some of the stuff I read. Ouch. My cough drops now before I get into the stories. Again, if you haven't heard, the book I'm reading is Echoes of the Southland, Book 1, from Bradley and Sharp. It is literally a collection of more or less antebellum stuff. Damn. Oh, I hate coughing. Yeah, that seems to do it every time I start reading. Thank you, Anaharu. I forgot what the about command was. So I choose you. Yeah, I love the fact I can do custom messages and I have them set up as auto shoutouts. So the first, I don't know how many custom messages I set up, but I thought that was appropriate. Let's switch over here. Hello. There he is. Okay. Maybe. Oh. Reactive images are always a little slow. I finally got around to actually programming a lurk message, so. Okay. guess I will get into the story since I'm at the 15-minute mark. Because I always try to be consistent on some things. Okay, the first, I guess it's a story, is Young Abel Yancey by Archibald Rutledge. If that old robber takes one of my kids and I can get to him, he'll have me to whip. Uh-huh. Little Abel Yancey looked skyward over the great mountains, in whose mighty shadow he stood, gazing at the powerful golden eagle wheeling in indolent superiority over a solitary peak. He thinks he can do as he pleases. Last week, when Brother Ben was minding these here goats, he came swooping down and carried off a kid. If he tries that thing with me, there's going to be a fight right here in the pasture. He needn't think he can feed his young ones on our little kids. Abel was threatened to whip the great eagle, judged in the light of the small lad's very frail appearance, did not seem impressive. Indeed, had the great marauding bird of the lonely mountain decided to make one of his fierce falls upon Abel, and had borne him away, the thing would not have seemed incredible. Abel was not yet 10, and his singularly slight build made him appear even younger. But in his clear blue eyes there was a light that told the story of a spirit and courage and determination. Therefore his remarks concerning the soaring eagle formed no idle threats. Those who knew little Abel knew well that the boy would carry through his purpose with a skill and independence that he credits the race of hardy mountaineers from whom he sprang. Far away in the wild heart of those mighty mountains that roll their blue beakers westward from North Carolina into Tennessee, nestled among the purple peaks and looking down in the fair valleys, now misty, now violet with the lights of evening or of morning, now veiled in thunderstorms, there you might see the tiny cabin of Brant Yancey, the home of little Abel. You should not think of these people as only mountaineers, for they belong to a great race of stalwart pioneers who came from the Highland of Scotland, and who, in spite of rigors of poverty, have retained an admirably pride, a haughty honesty, and a high spirit of their ancestors. Singular, indeed, was the calling of this particular mountain man. He was a herder of goats, and he had many flocks, and these he rented to neighbors who, having lumbered their land, wanted to get rid of the undergrowth. Goats can accomplish this arduous task, and the Yancey goats were known for a radius of many a long mountain mile. Usually the goats needed no attention, but in the late winter and the early spring, when the young were born, they had to be guarded. And those wild mountains were wildcats, panthers, and eagles. It was against the enemies of these that little Abel, 8 miles from home, was watching one of the largest of the Yancey herds. He had with him no weapon save for a stout hickory stick. Toward sundown he would drive the herd into the central pasture down in the mountain, where his father and his brothers would bring theirs, and there the goats would spend the night, their number, their manner of herding, for the dark hours, and the rude stockade making for safety. But in these high and separate pastures, the watchers were responsible for the safety of the creatures under their care. Abel, sturdy in spirit, though slight of frame, felt the full weight of his responsibility, and when he saw the great eagle wheeling as if for a fall, he was instantly aware of the menace. He knew enough of eagles to realize that his present duty was, and what was the meaning of the lordly bird's particular maneuvers in the air. "I believe," he said, "I'd better take these here goats and kids down the mountain. It's early, but I don't think that thing flying up yonder. It's powerful quick." Through the still mountain pasture, now shimmering in the sunlight of the mid-afternoon, and then the delicate greens of the first month of the springtime, the voice of Abel now sounded out. He called the goats together. His voice was high and pleading. From almost every direction they came running. The playful little kids scampered, gambled, and jumped and frolicked over the huckleberry bushes. They knew well what the call meant, and they were obeying it willingly. Up the bushy slope, an old ewe walked slowly with her 2 kids. One was a jetty black, and the other was a soft brown. They were wee things, and very appealing in their innocent beauty. "That old Betty yonder sure is slow," said Abel, his eyes resting with affection and amusement on his favorite of the whole flock. "She thinks most as much of them 2 kids as Brother Ben and I do," he added, with a smile. But the smile on his boyish face changed into an expression of sudden rage. As if he had been shot out of a gun, he rushed down the mountain. "You there!" cried his shrill voice. "You black robber, get you here!" Gasping and swinging the hickory stick in a fury, he rushed down upon the mighty golden eagle that had fallen upon the brown kid. Abel thought to reach the huge bird before it rose. It had seemed to stay on the ground a long time. He knew it was fixing the long talons in its helpless prey, but the boy was too late. The eagle's powerful wings beat up the air with ponderous strength. By the time Abel reached the spot where he had been, the dark marauder was high as the chestnut sprouts, gripped by its cruel talons and the pitiful victim. Near the boy, the old mother goat cowered, her other baby quaking in the shelter of her flank. She bleated mournfully. After one glance at her, Abel's eyes followed the eagle's flight. Instead of crossing the deep valley, the great bird beat steadily up the mountainside. Far up, amid the plume-like solitary pines, there was a gray cairn of rocks, almost a mile from where the boy stood. It was upon these rocks that the eagle alighted, and from something in the eagle's behavior, visible even at the distance through the crystal mountain atmosphere, Abel could not doubt but that he was looking for the eagle's hire. "That's where he has his nest," the boy said, "and I'm going up there. I don't know, but maybe the brown kid will still be alive. Leastwise, I can at least tell Ben and the others that I did something and wasn't asleep. I may get the chance to fight him yet," he added, with a brightening face, as he turned his steps with quick decision towards the dim pathway leading up the wild mountain. It was a strange sight to see this light, barefooted lad running with agile steps up the rain-gilded pathway. There was no other human being within miles. Down in the pasture, all would have been safe and quiet, but he was going on his own initiative into certain danger. Abel Yancey, however, thought not of the danger, but of his duty he owed his father, who had trusted him to guard one great herd of goats. Blood tells, and it tells best where there is no witness, no substitutes, where the stakes may be life and death. It took Abel scarcely 10 minutes to reach the shelf of rocks that joined the beetling gray cairn on the mountain side. There, sheltered by the gloomy pines, he looked over the gray cliff upon which he had seen the golden eagle alight. From his position, he could see no eagle, no brown kid, and no eagle's eyrie. Abel wondered if he had, by mistake, come to the wrong cliff. But suddenly, even as he doubted, he saw movement far out on the verge of the lofty cliff. "It's the brown kid," the boy exclaimed. "He ain't dead. I done seen him bat his ear. Where's the eagle?" He asked himself as he climbed out under the shadows of the mighty pines and emerged on the dizzy cliff that sprang outward from the mountain. He had in his hand the hickory stick. As Abel stepped out on the high rocks that seemed suspended above the valley, he had a sense of danger. Far below him lay the pasture he had left. The cliff fell away sheerly into space. Through hundreds of feet below, there were the grizzled tops of certain storm-blasted trees. The rocks on the promontory were heaped in rude confusion, and some of these gave a kind of shelter, in which the great eagles had made their nest. The male bird, eyeing his prey to the cliff, had left it in the lofty brink and across the space between the edge and the eyrie. He was with the young birds when Abel came upon him. With harsh hissing of anger and of hate, the eagle beat his way upward. Then he swooped to the point in the rock on the verge of his eyrie. The boy facing him was intent on one thing. He meant to rescue the brown kid from its desperate position. He could see that it was still alive. Once, indeed, it bleated feebly, appealingly. "I'm going to get it," said Abel Yancey. "And that there robber, he's going to try to keep it for himself." He had stated the problem simply and truly. As there was no sign of the other eagle, Abel counted on a single enemy alone. Glancing about him carefully, he took his bearings. He saw the robber's nest under a shelving rock. There were young in it, and they were almost feathered. But with them the lad had nothing to do. His eye measured the distance between himself and the kid lying out on the very brink of the precipice. He wondered that the eagle should leave it there. The distance between the little goat and the rescuer was about 20 feet. The gray rocks on the cliff had been worn until they were slippery. There were great seams and cracks in them, and Abel saw at least one gap in the cliff that appeared to have been made with a recent fall of a section of the stone face. Would the beetling brink hold his weight? As he drew near the eagle's prey, would the monstrous bird attack him? Could he keep his balance with the eagle battling him for the possession of the brown kid? These questions might have arisen in the boy's mind, but his answers to all of them might be found in what he did. Swinging his hickory stick menacingly, he shouted at the eagle, at the same time stepping forward resolutely on those perilous rocks that no human foot, except possibly that of an Indian of the ancient days, had ever trod. The golden eagle rose on skillful wings and swung in a great circle behind the boy. It seemed that the big bird was trying to get at Abel's back. The lad turned to face the danger. He whirled his stick and cried out defiantly at his attacker. At the same time, he backed slowly towards the terrible brink of the cliff. He watched each step. He frequently paused, for the walking backward made him dizzy. Once, after a backward glance during which his eye had caught sight of the empty chasm over the edge of the cliff, he put out his stick to steady himself. The stick seemed to not touch anything, and Abel, to keep his balance, was forced to suddenly let it go. It dropped into the sloping crevice whose bottom it had fallen to touch when the boy held it. Abel saw it slide down, and then it shot into space. Its fall showed the mountain lad how a thing looked as if it left the hanging crag, and imagined to his mind the dizzying momentum of the drop. At such moments, almost any boy, having adventured thus far, would have abandoned the attempt of rescue. But, though he now had no kind of weapon, Abel Yancey felt rising in him the determination that he would never yield a foot's space on that cliff to the eagle. The blood of an ancient heroic race was in his veins, making and keeping him strong. But Abel approached the brink of the cliff. He changed his tactics. Watching the eagle carefully, he picked his chance and stooped low, then lay down on the rocks. The eagle, becoming bolder, swept just over his head. Though the lad did not see the motion, the mighty bird had struck him with his curved beak. Slowly, painfully, cunningly, Abel made his way backwards up the sloping cliff, drawing nearer to the kid. Evidently, the little thing had sensed the attempt to rescue it. At least it knew that Abel, whose hands had petted it, was near. Once, in looking back, the lad saw the kid try to rise. It could not, And for this Abel was glad, for there was danger lest it fall off the cliff in the moment it staggered to its feet. The boy had now come to the point out of reach of the object of his rescue. Suddenly he felt his bare feet leave the rock. He knew they were over the edge of the cliff. He must go no farther. All this while he had been keeping the eagle off the sharp shouts and fiercely striking at the attacking bird with his bare fists. But the wary eagle appeared to know what a disadvantage he had his enemy, a disadvantage that increased as Abel neared the eagle's prey. Just as the boy ceased his critical descent, the eagle, now wholly bold, alighted fairly on Abel's back, and the talons that had brought the brown kid so high, so far, now raked the lad's flesh. Abel turned himself swiftly on his back, and the savage bird cleared itself. The boy was now almost within reach of the kid. Shouting at the eagle, he leaned forward toward the pitiful, crumpled little object. The eagle, at the same moment, seeing himself about to be robbed of his prey, made a desperate swoop from behind, striking Abel at the base of his neck with his full weight and all the force of his flight. The boy was lifted from the rock. He was hurled forward, almost stunned. He clutched manfully at the brink of the gray cliff, but when he fully came to his senses, all his blood was in his head, and he was hanging partly over the awful chasm. Dimly, in the fearful moment, he seemed to hear the voice of his father, though it was but his memory that it sounded. "Abel," he said, "be a man. You got to be a man, son." It was what his mountaineer father had said to him 100 times. "I got to be a man," muttered little Abel, clutching the sharp edges of the perilous cliff. The eagle, in rising from him, had torn his back cruelly, and the sight of the blood from those wounds and of the fearful chasm which he seemed to have dropped were enough to shake his strength. If he could turn around, he might pull himself to safety. He had tried to push back, but he could make no progress that way. He had to turn. The eagle, meanwhile, satisfied now that he had little to fear from the boy, was swinging back towards him. Abel set his teeth, made his muscles hard, and summoned all his strength to turn on the cairn's brink without slipping. He maneuvered with a cautious skill, and at last succeeded, although the sudden blow from the eagle's powerful wings unbalanced him. For a moment his feet and legs swinging violently over the cliff, but he clutched and gripped the sharp rock with one hand, and wriggled his body back up the ledge until his head had turned away from the chasm, and he could no longer see the terrible spearheads of the blasted trees hundreds of feet below. He was near fainting, however, when the eagle whirled upon him with a savage blow. The boy struck upward with his free hand, and it came in contact with the bird's great heavy feet. The sudden thought shot like fire through the mountain lad's mind. The eagle was coming for another stroke. He would swoop down again in a moment. The circling took him over the chasm and then back, then up over the eyrie. Abel watched this route, holding on now with the strength he had of new hope. The boy waited for the eagle's return. As soon as the ponderous form swept lower, hovering above its victim, with a deft upward reach of his left arm, Abel caught the eagle fairly about the ankles. Taken by surprise, the great black robber beat its wings powerfully. Abel began to shout. The eagle strained upwards, heading in the direction of his eyrie. The boy let the bird struggle. He, too, pulled with all his might. And soon his body was drawn clear of the edge of the cliff. Then, in a moment, realizing the solid rock was once more beneath his feet, unsure of his safety, he released his hold of the eagle, and the great bird soared off in the disheveled splendor of flight. Abel, for a moment, sat on a boulder, breathing heavily. His eye was still upon the eagle, now high above the mountain pines. Suddenly he heard a faint sound beside him. It was the little brown kid. Abel, with great tenderness, took the trembling animal in his arms and started across the shelf of rocks. In another moment, he was in the dim pathway leading down the mountain. He was so busily examining the hurts of the creatures that he was carrying that he had no thought of his own. "Old Betty will be glad to get her baby back," he said. Then, thinking of his father, he added in his simple way, "Reckon I'll tell Pop about this. Tell him not to shoot the eagle, 'cause he helped me keep him dropping off with that place. Didn't exactly whip him," he went on, "but I gave him a big a scare, I reckon, as he give me. Ain't it so, you little brown kid?" Okay. Ouch. Would not have thought about doing that. And using the eagle to pull you out of the chasm because it was freaked out too. That was a golden eagle. Those things get pretty good sized. Maybe not as big as the kid. Well, I say the kid, the boy. But dang. Okay. Alright, the next story is... Actually, it looks like it's a poem. Have You Heard the South A-Calling? By Henry Elliot Harman. Have you plucked the snowy daisies in the spring? Then a memory of their sweetness must cling to the past with all its treasure, to the past untainted treasure, that in your soul forevermore will sing. Have you watched the snowy daisy fields at night? Every stem with heart of gold and petals white, with the moonlight on them streaming, and a half the stars a-dreaming, and love beside you walking in the light. Have you heard the mockbird singing soft and low, in the stillness of the night time singing slow, with the harvest moon a-clinging to the sky where stars are flinging worlds of light because they love the daisy so? Then you've heard the South a-calling in the spring, when the crocus comes a-bloomin', dainty thing. No matter where you wander, o'er these memories you'll ponder, when you hear the South a-calling in the spring. Alright. Really wish I could do something with this coffee. It's annoying. And I've already finished my water. Figures. Alright, the next one looks like it is another story. The Torch of Civilization by Thomas Nelson Page. Standing here on this great anniversary at the very end of the century, facing a new century, it is impossible that one should not look back, and equally impossible that one should not look forward. We are just at the close of what we call, and call rightly, a century of great achievement. We pride ourselves upon the works the country has accomplished. We point at the government based on the consent of the governed, which as the world has never seen. Wealth, and which has been piled up as no country has ever attained within the time, or double or quadruple that time. It is such a condition of life that has never existed in any other country. From Desert Mountain to the Golden Gate, yes, from the islands which Columbus saw, thinking he had found the East Indies, to the West Indies themselves, where, even as I speak, the American flag is being planted. Our possessions and our wealth extend. We have, through the fallen arts of peace, an army ready to rise at the sound of the bugle, greater than Rome was ever able to summon behind her golden eagles. We are right to call in the century of achievement. We pride ourselves upon it. Now, who achieved that? Well, not we, personally. Our fathers achieved it. Your fathers and my fathers. Your fathers, when they left England, set their prows westward and landed upon the rock-bound coast. When they drew up on their compact the civil government, which was a new thing in the history of the world. We did our part in the South, and when the time came we stopped all that they had upon the principle of government based only upon the consent of the governed. We pride ourselves upon the fact that we can worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience. We speak easily of God, whose service is perfect freedom. But it was not we, but our fathers who achieved that. Our fathers left us a heritage, and it was brought forth abundantly. I say this to draw clearly the line between where we were in material wealth and that which is real wealth and welfare of people. We are rich, but our fathers were poor. How did they achieve it? Not by their wealth, but by their character, by their devotion to principle. When I was thinking of the speech I was to make here tonight, I asked the descendant of a New Englander what he would say was the best thing that the fathers had left to the country. He thought for a second and made me a wise answer. He said, I think it was their character. That is indeed the heritage they left us. They left us their character. Wealth will not preserve which they left us, nor wealth, nor power, nor dalliance, nor wits will preserve it. Nothing but that which is of the spirit will preserve it. Nothing but character. The whole story of civilization speaks this truth with trumpet voice. One nation rises upon the ruins of another nation. It is when Samson lies in the lap of Delilah that the enemy steals upon him and ensnares him and binds him. It was when the great Assyrian king walked through the palace and looking around and said within his pride, Is not the great Babylon that I have built for the honor of the kingdom and for the honor of my majesty, that the voice came to him, even while the words were still in the king's mouth, saith the chronicle, Thy kingdom is departed from thee. It was when Belshazzar sat feasting in the Babylonian palace, with his lords and ladies, eating and drinking out of the golden vessels that had been sacred to the Lord, that the writing came upon the wall, Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. Not only in the palace, but all through the great city there was feasting and dancing. Why should they not feast? Why should they not dance? They were secure, with walls that were 350 feet high, 85 feet thick, and with 100 brazen gates, the city filled with greater wealth than had been brought before within walls. But out in the country a few hardy mountaineers had been digging ditches for some time. Nobody took much account of them, yet even that night, in the midst of Belshazzar's luxury and feasting, the veteran troops of Cyrus were marching silently under the dripping walls, down the bed to the lower Euphrates, so that which had been the very passageway of Babylon's wealth became the passageway of her ruin. Unless we preserve the character and the institutions our fathers give us, we will go down as other nations have gone. We may talk and theorize as much as we please, but this is the law of nature. The stronger pushes the weaker to the wall and takes its place. In the history of civilization, one nation rises and becomes the torchbearer, and then another takes the torch as it becomes stronger, and the stronger always pushing the weaker aside and becoming, in its turn, the leader. So it has been with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Median, and coming down on, with the Greek and the Roman, the Frank, And then came the great race, the Anglo-Saxon Teutonic race, which seems to me today to be the great torchbearer for this land and for the next coming time. Each nation that has borne the torch of civilization has followed some path particularly its own. Egyptian, Syrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Frank, all had their ideal of power, order, and progress directed under supreme authority, maintained by an armed organization. We bear the torch of civilization because we possess the principles of civil liberty, and we have the character, or should have the character, which our fathers have transmitted to us, which to uphold it. If we have it not, then be sure with the certainty that law of nature, some nation, it may be one or it may be another, may it be the Grecian, may it be the Slav, already knocking on our doors, will push us from the way, and take the torch and bear it onward, and we shall go down. But I have no fear of the future. I think, looking round upon the country at present, that even if it would seem to us at times that there are greatest perils which confront us, that even though there may be evidence of weakening in our character, and notwithstanding this, I say, I believe the great Anglo-Saxon race, not only on the other side of the water, but on this side of the water, and when I say the Anglo-Saxon race, I mean the great white English-speaking race. I use the other term because there is none more satisfactory to me, contains elements which alone can continue to be the leaders of civilization, the elements of fundamental power, abiding virtue, public and private. Wealth will not preserve a state. It must be the aggregation of individual integrity of its members and its citizens that shall preserve it. That integrity, I believe, exists deep-rooted among our people. Sometimes when I read accounts of vice here and there eating into the heart of the people, I feel inclined to be pessimistic. But when I come face to face with the American and see him in his life, as he truly is, when I reflect on the great body of our people that stretch from one side of this country to the other, their homes perched on every hill and nestled in every valley, and recognize the sterling virtue and the kind character that sustains it, built on the rocks and the principles that our fathers transmitted only, my pessimism disappears, and I know that only for this immediate time, but for many long generations to come, with that reservoir of virtue to draw from, we shall sustain and carry both ourselves and the whole human race forward. Okay, that turned surprisingly racist in the last couple of paragraphs. I mean, seriously, the line, I believe the great Anglo-Saxon race, not only on the other side of the water, but of this side of the water. And when I say Anglo-Saxon race, I mean the great white English-speaking race. I mean, shit. Man. Again, I apologize for anything that comes up in this, but harsh words are history. And that is just that whole definition right there. Say it one more time just because I want to make sure it's said clearly that this was, let's see, this is Torch of Civilization. Let me see when this particular one was written, because it should be listed in here. But that was a speech. Made it at college. What the hell? Okay, I'm looking for the Torch of Civilization. When was this written? Spotlight, Tornado, Spring Pond, Smallpox. Oh, cool. The Invention of Contingents in here. is it? I know it's on here somewhere. Yeah, it's crazy that was in a speech. I don't know when it was. Tell me that's the page. Torch of. Come on, where is it? I'm not seeing it on here. Come on, I want to know the year. I'm trying to read very small text to find this. Where is it? Clearly it was turn of the century because he was talking about looking forward. How much progress they had made. Yeah, progress. Then. I don't see that listed. Ugh. I'm probably just putting too much thought into this thing. It's not something I'm probably going to repeat ever again. So let's go ahead and move on to the next. Oh man, there was a nose pass? I swear I'm going to program an auto catch. Okay. Next story is Love of Country by Charles Gayarre. No man knows the intense love he nourishes for his own country before he visits foreign lands. The man most at home may find fault with it, but should he find by compulsion or even voluntarily turn away and depart from what excited his displeasure, reprobation, or disgust, why lo, distance lends enchantment to the scene. Visitor memory wakes up and stirs the very depths of his soul. Endearing recollections crowd upon him, and the cherished image of the native country looms before him. It becomes to him the perpetual mirage, and tempts him back outstretched arms. like the loving and forgiving mother who is always ready to welcome the return of her prodigal son. If I had ever entertained doubts on the subject, they would have been removed by what happened to myself. I had been compelled to go to Europe in the hope of repairing a broken constitution, and that hope had been realized after a residence of several years in France. I loved France before I saw her. I loved her still more when I became better acquainted with her merits. She was the motherland of some of my ancestors, and history was household history to me. I took pride in her strength, in her civilization, in her prosperity, and in her prodigious achievements in war and peace. She was the revered parent of my native state of Louisiana. I was received by the French as one of them. I appreciated keenly all those social enjoyments which are to be met with people that highly refined and chivalrous people. I secured the esteem and attachment of valuable friends. I became deeply grateful for the hospitalities ever to be remembered. And yet, under such circumstances, with such feelings in my breast, I could not keep my imagination from constantly wandering back across the Atlantic. One day, homesick, I was strolling along at the random in the streets of Marseille, where I had just arrived. I was walking with my eyes bent to the ground, and careless which way my steps would lead me, when suddenly lifting up my head, I found myself in front of the harbor. At a short distance, full in view, stood an American frigate, with all the symmetrical beauty of her noble proportions, and with her proud flag, which I had not seen for several years, streaming in the wind. Rapidly drawing near her, the quay was one of her boats, impelled by the vigorous arms of a crew who seemed to have been picked from the fittest specimens of those stout hearts who are the pride of our navy. At the helm stood erect a young officer, who looked worthy of being commander of such men. At that sight I felt as if I had received an electric shock. My whole body trembled with nervous excitement. The blood rushed to my heart. My eyes became moist with tears, and I gazed on entranced. Ah, had France loaded me with all the honors and wealth with the ambition of man can crave, had I 100 times sworn allegiance to her and renounced the United States, I felt, at the moment I speak of, that had the safety of the frigate on which my eyes were riveted been threatened by those fortifications which surround her, my voice would have been made at once. I would have said to France, "Touch her not! Lay not thy fingers on a single one of her spurs, or take back the honors, titles, and wealth showered upon me. I return to that first allegiance which was inscribed in my heart by God. I will plant my foot on the deck above which waves that flag which I cannot live to see pulled down. My destiny shall cling to her last plank of that ship as long as it floats upon the water. It was a lesson taught me that will be long remembered." And I hate this cough. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, by John Esten Cooke. Okay. Do you remember the Culpeper Minutemen, which the rattlesnake and its motto, "Don't tread on me," or "No step on stick"? Found one of those flags where it would say, actually. These brave men took part of the Battle of Great Bridge against Lord Dunmore, and I will tell you about a young lieutenant of these Minutemen who pursued the British after the fall of Fordyce. His name was John Marshall, and he was afterward the Chief Justice of the United States. This ought to make you desire to hear more about him, but besides this, he was so great and good a man that he deserves a place in any book relating to the distinguished men of Virginia. He was the son of Colonel Thomas Marshall of Fauquier, a brave soldier who had 15 children. His property was small, and his means very moderate, but his wife and daughters, it is even said, had to use thorns instead of pins to pin their sleeves. This they did not mind, however, and a small farm was managed so well that Colonel Marshall gave his children a good education, besides teaching them always to be true and honest. They lived near Manassas Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and here young John passed his boyhood until the Revolution, when he was elected lieutenant of the Minutemen and marched towards Norfolk. He fought bravely there, and everybody was fond of him. He was not a very handsome person. He was tall and thin, but his face beamed with good humor, and his black eyes seemed to smile at everybody, even when he was much liked. He also read poetry in a very sweet voice, and when the Minutemen marched on Yorktown after the fighting, young John Marshall used to go by General Nelson's house and read poems to the young ladies, and it was said that they thought his reading was the sweetest in the world. I tell you this, which may seem very trifling, because almost anything about a grand so great ought to interest us. And, for that matter, in my little story I mean to tell you scarcely anything but anecdotes, and I am glad to do so, and leave out the rest, for, after all, these little details about distinguished people often give you a better idea of them than the facts in regard to their public lives. John Marshall continued in the army during the whole war, and those who fought with him said that he was not only brave, but that nothing could put him in low spirits. When Washington spent the dreary winter with his little army at Valley Forge near Philadelphia, the times were so dark, and the sufferings of the soldiers were great, that they nearly gave way to despair, but John Marshall never did. Like the rest, he had to tramp through the deep snow to gather a little wood to keep himself from freezing. But in the midst of all this, his friends said afterwards, he was still bright and hopeful. Seated by the campfire, he would tell stories, and laugh, and cheer up his comrades, and thus keep them in good spirits when they were downhearted. He was an excellent soldier, you see, and bore all the hardships of the hard time without a murmur. He had scarcely clothes to wear, and had no money to buy them, and it was related that, when he visited home once, he was obliged to return to the army on foot, and that so shabbily dressed as a tavern-keeper in Philadelphia would not let him come into his house. But for this he did not care. He knew that he was going to do his duty, and he went on cheerfully performing it without a murmur to the last. When the Revolution ended, John Marshall came back to Virginia, a poor young fellow, with scarcely a penny in the world, but he was not disheartened. He resolved to go to work, and as he managed to learn a little law, he began to practice, and soon got married. His wife was one of the young ladies whom he had read poetry to in Yorktown in 1775, after the Battle of Great Bridge, and her name was Mary Willis Ambler. She had never forgotten the bright black eyes and the sweet smile and voice of the tall young soldier, and now gave him her hand. He was so poor at the time that he gave the parson who married them the last golden guinea he had in the world. But poor as he was happy with his young wife, and he loved her so much that he seemed to think no one else in comparison with her. But when they were old and she was sick, he would walk about the house and yard with his shoes off and hardly speak above his breath, and anyone could see that she was dearer to him than when she was a rosy-cheeked young girl. After her death, he wrote these words. On the 3rd of January, 1783, I was united with the holiest bonds to the woman I adored. From the moments of our union to that of our separation, I never ceased to thank heaven for this, its best gift. Not a moment passed in which I did not consider her a blessing for which the chief happiness of my life was derived. Hers was a religion taught by the Savior of men. I have lost her, and with her lost the solace of my life. Some of these days you will read about the great Chief Justice Marshal, and find that people thought of him. He began, you know, as a poor young lawyer, but everybody soon saw that he was a man of wonderful genius. There was scarcely any office which he would accept that people did not offer him. He served in the legislature, then in the convention to ratify the Constitution. Then he was sent to envoy of France. Then he was made Secretary of State. And then Chief Justice of the United States, where the greatest judges, even the great Judge Story, my father told me, looked up to him and listened to what he had to say, and if he decided everything. When he died at the age of 80, nearly, he was one of the greatest and most famous men in America. Now, for a few anecdotes about him, for I wish you to know the man, John Marshall. My father knew him very well and loved him, and told me many things about him. I am bleeding, apparently, but, well. He was very tall and thin, dressed very plainly. He wore a suit of plain black cloth and common yarn stockings, which fitted tightly on his legs, and showed how thin they were. He was a very great walker, and would often walk out to his farm, which was several miles from Richmond where he lived, and back without thinking of ordering his carriage. But sometimes he went on horseback, and old Bishop Meade said he'd met him one day riding on the farm, with a bag of clover seed on the saddle before him. His manners were simple and friendly, and he liked to talk about everyday matters with plain country people, and laugh and jest with them. As to this poorly dressed man being the great Chief Justice Marshal, it was hard to make a stranger believe such a thing. He never seemed to remember that he was a great man at all, and played games of quoits, with his coat off at Backman's Spring in Richmond, as full of fun as a boy and ready to laugh with everybody. In a word, he was the man so great that he was plain and simple. And I will wind up my little talk about him with an anecdote or so, which shall show you this. At that time, it was the fashion among the gentlemen of Richmond to walk to market early in the morning, and buy fresh meats and vegetables for their family dinners. This was a good old fashion, and some famous old gentleman among them was distinguished Benjamin Watkins Leigh, whom I knew and loved, used to do so to the end of their lives. It was the habit of Judge Marshall, and very often he took no servant with him. He would buy what he wanted and return home with his marketing. And on one of these occasions, the little incident I will speak of took place. Judge Marshall had gone to market and made his purchases when, just as he was going home, he heard somebody swearing angrily not from far behind him. He turned around and saw that the hubbub was about. A finely dressed young man, who seemed to be a stranger, had come to market and bought a turkey. He then looked around for someone to take it home, but as no one could be found, he grew angry and began to curse and swear. Judge Marshall listened and stepped up on him, asking politely, "Where do you live, sir?" The young man looked at the plainly dressed old man, and told him where he lived. "That is my way," said Judge Marshall with a smile, "and I will take it for you." The young man handed him the turkey and left the market, followed by Judge Marshall, and they soon reached the house where the former lived. Marshall then politely handed him the turkey and turned to go. "What shall I pay you?" said the young man. "Oh, nothing," replied Marshall. "You are welcome. It was on my way, and no trouble." With which he had bowed and walked on. while the young man looked after him with a puzzled expression. He had, no doubt, begun to think that he had made some mistake, and as the citizen was passing, he said, pointing after Marshall, "Who is that polite old gentleman who brought home my turkey for me?" "Oh, that's John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States," replied the citizen. The young man was perfectly astounded, and exclaimed, "Why did he bring home my turkey?" "To give you a reprimand and learn you to attend to mind your own business," replied the citizen, and walked off. This little anecdote will show you the character of John Marshall, but I do not believe that he brought home the young man's turkey to give him a reprimand. Another person might have done so, but John Marshall never seemed to have any desire to reprimand people. He was too sweet-tempered and kindly to take the pleasure in doing so, and I have no doubt he carried the turkey home for a pure wish to do the obliging. I might tell you more stories, how, among other things, he once met an old army comrade, who he said would be ruined unless he could get $3,000. When Marshall privately left him a check for the amount to be handed him, then rode away to escape his thanks. These anecdotes I have related will give you some idea about the great man and how simple and unpretending he was, as all really great men are. He did nothing for effect, as the phrase is, and he never seemed to feel that he was greater than the humblest countryman of his acquaintance. And this was all the stranger, if you remember what I said about the public opinion of him. The greatest judges of the United States at Washington looked up to him as superior, and whenever he passed, men took off their hats to show their respect for him. But this did not have any effect on him. He was a simple old gentleman with a friendly smile, ready to chat with anyone and do them kindness, and just as devoted Christian too, which was, more than all, as humble before God as the humblest. I said that I had no time to relate other anecdotes of John Marshall, but I cannot pass over one referring to his faith in Christianity. One day an old gentleman was seen to drive up the tavern to the Valley of Virginia in a shabby one-horse gig, the shafts of which were broken and tied together with hickory bark. He was a plain-looking old man, and wore common yarn stockings, and when he went in and sat down, nobody took any notice of him. In the tavern were some young lawyers, and as night came on, they got into an argument about the truth of Christianity, one of them sneering at it, and the other speaking in favor of it. All this time the old man in the yarn stockings had been sitting in the corner, smiling and listening, until at last they were tired out. They laughed and gave up the argument, but one of them turned around and said, "Well, old gentleman, what do you think of these things?" They all turned around and looked at him, expecting, probably, that he would have nothing to say. Never were any persons more mistaken. The old gentleman began quietly and went on for nearly an hour without stopping. Excuse me. What he said was all in favor of the truth of the Christian religion, and his arguments were so powerful that the young lawyers listened in perfect amazement. If a streak of lightning had flashed before them, one after them other words, they would not have been more startled than by hearing the grand reasoning from such plain-looking old gentlemen. They were all keen lawyers, but they all felt that this old stranger was their master. Another of them said that to try to describe his language would be like attempting to paint the beams of the sun. At last he finished, and with a smile on his face, retired. Then everybody was anxious to find out who this wonderful old countryman with a shabby coat and the yarn stockings could be. This they soon discovered. He was John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States. I have told you this anecdote because I wish you to see the greatest intellects are the first to bow their heads before the mastery of Christianity. It is well to remember this when we find things so many people are weak minds sneering about holy things. John Marshall's mind was one of the greatest and strongest that man ever had, and he was a humble believer, if the young lawyers were not. He was such to the day of his death, and never went to bed at night without kneeling down and saying the Lord's Prayer, and the old verse which his mother had taught him. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep, and should I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, and this I ask for Jesus' sake. I never knew that last line. Interesting. This is all I have to tell you about the great John Marshall. It is not much, and I might say a great deal more, but you have an idea of him, and see what sort of person he was. There never was a finer example of our good old Virginia country stock of people, which gave so many great men to the land we live in. He was honest, brave, simple-minded, and had a vast intellect. You may not have an intellect like his, few human beings ever had, but you can imitate his sweet temper and good heart. He lived before my time, but I know a great deal about him, and I can tell you he valued goodness far above mere strength of mind. Oh, that's kind of interesting. John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States, at the turn of the previous century. Ow. Man, my head is sore. Okay. Oh, well, we are into part 3 now. History in Southern Literature. Okay, how long is this going to be? I got 45 minutes or so I'll keep going. As it is, these things start with a poem, so this is part 3 of the book, and we're starting with a poem. Would we go forward boldly and gain heart? For farther progress we must pause a while, and gaze upon the path for many a mile we followed when we first grew bold to start. That so much has been traversed is a good to fresh endeavor. William Gilmore Simms. Alright. And the first story of this section is The Early Life of George Washington by Mason Locke Weems. What a name. Some of his historians have said, and many believe, that Washington was a Latin scholar. Never heard that. But 'tis an error. That's probably why. He never learned a syllable of Latin. His second and last teacher, Mr. Williams, was indeed a capital hand, but not in Latin, for of that he understood perhaps as little as Balaam's ass. But at reading, spelling, English, grammar, arithmetic, surveying, bookkeeping, geography, he was indeed famous. And in these useful arts, 'tis said, he often boasted that he made young George Washington as great a scholar as himself. Born to be a soldier, Washington early discovered symptoms of nature's intentions towards him. In his 11th year, while at school under Mr. Hobby, he used to divide his playmates into 2 parties, or armies. One of these, for distinction's sake, he called the French, the other American. A big boy at the school named William Bustle commanded the former. George commanded the latter. and every day at playtime, with corn stalks for muskets and calabashes for drums, the two armies would turn out, march, countermarch, and file off or fight their mimic battles with great fury. This was fine sport for George, whose passion for active exercise was so strong that at playtime no weather could keep him within doors. His fair cousins, who visited at his mother's, used to complain that George was not fond of their company, like other boys. But as soon as he got his task, he would run out to play. But such trifling play as marbles and tops he could never endure. I don't know, they're kind of fun. They did not afford him exercise enough. His delight was in the manliest sort, which, by stringing the limbs and swelling the muscles, promotes the kindliest flow of blood and spirits. At jumping with a long pole or heaving heavy weights, for his years he hardly had any equal. And, as to running, the swift-footed Achilles could scarcely have matched his speed. "Egad, he ran wonderfully," said an amicable and aged friend, John Fitzhugh, Esquire, who knew him well. "We had nobody hereabouts that could come near him. He was a young Langhorne Dade of Westmoreland, a confounded, clean-made, and tight young fellow, and a mighty swift runner, too. But then he had no match for George. Langy indeed. He did not give up, and would brag that he had sometimes brought George to a tie. But I believe he was mistaken, for I have seen them run together for many a time, and George always beat him easily enough." Colonel Lewis Willis, his playmate and kinsman, has been heard to say that he has often seen him throw a stone across Rappahannock at the lower ferry of Fredericksburg. It would be no easy matter to find a man, nowadays, who could do it. Indeed, his father before him was a man of great extraordinary strength. His gun, which to this day is called Washington's fowling piece, is now the property of Mr. Harry Fitzhugh of Cotink, which is of enormous weight that not one man in 50 can fire it without arrest. And yet throughout that country it is said that he made nothing of it holding at arm's length, and blazing away at the swans of the Potomac. He has been known to kill, rank and file, 7 or 8 at a shot. Yeah. But return to George. It appears that from the start he was a boy of an uncommonly warm and noble heart, that Lawrence, though but his half-brother, took such a liking to him, even above his own brother Augustine, that he would always have George with him when he could, and often pressed him to come and live with him. But, as if led by some secret impulse, George declined the offer, and, as we have seen, went to work in the backwoods as Lord Fairfax's surveyor. However, when Lawrence was taken by the consumption, and advised by his physicians to take a trip to Bermuda, George could not resist any longer, but hastened down to his brother at Mount Vernon and went with him to Bermuda. It was at Bermuda that George took the smallpox, which marked him rather agreeably than otherwise. Lawrence never recovered, but returned to Virginia, where he died just after his brother George had fought his hard battle against the French and the Indians at Fort Necessity, as the reader will presently learn. Lawrence did not live to see George after that, but he lived to hear of his fame. For as the French and the Indians were at the time a great public terror, the people could not help being very loud at the praise of the youth who, with so slender a force, had dared to meet them in their own country, and had given them such a check. And when Lawrence heard of his favorite young brother that he had fought so gallantly for his country that the whole island was filled with his praise, he wept for joy. And such is the victory of love over nature that, though fast sinking under the fever and cough of consumption in its extreme stage, he did not seem to mind it, but spent his last moments in fondly talking of his brother George, who, he said, he was always believed one day or another would be a great man. On opening his will, it was found that George had lost nothing but his dutiful and affectionate behavior to his brother, Lawrence. For having now no issue, the only child, a little daughter, lately dying, he left to George all his rich lands in Berkeley, together with his great estate on the Potomac, called Mount Vernon, in honor of the Admiral Vernon, by whom he had been treated with great politeness while volunteer with him in the unfortunate siege of Carthagena in 1741. Oh, that explains it. Did not know about that. It's cool. Happily for America, George was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or a cold toilet in his apartment. The Rappahannock plantation left him by his father was only a reversion, and his mother was still in her prime. Seeing then no chance of ever rising in the world but by his own merits, on leaving school he went up to Fairfax to see his brother Lawrence, with whom he found Mr. William Fairfax, one of the governor's council, who was come upon the visits to his sister, whom Lawrence had been married. The councillor presently took a great liking to George, and hearing him express a wish to employment as a surveyor, he introduced him to the relative, Lord Fairfax, the wealthy proprietor of all those lands, generally called the Northern Neck, lying between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, and extending from Smith's Point on the Chesapeake to the foot of the great Allegheny. At the instance of the councillor, Lord Fairfax readily engaged George as surveyor, and sent him up to the backwoods to work. He continued in his lordship's service until his 20th year, closely pursuing the laborious life of a woodsman. From the manner in which Washington chose to amuse his leisure hours during this period, I am almost inclined to think that he had a presentiment of the great labors that lay before him, when, in Frederick, which at the time was very large, containing the counties now called Berkeley, Jefferson, and Shenandoah, he boarded in the house of Widow Stevenson, generally pronounced Stenson. This lady had 7 sons, William and Valentine Crawford by the first husband, John and Hugh and Dick and Jim and Mark Stenson by the last husband. These 7 young men, in Herculean size and strength, were equal, perhaps, to any 7 sons any one mother christened them. This was a family exactly to George's mind, because promising him an abundance of manly exercise in which he delighted. In front of the house lay a fine extended green with a square of several hundred yards. Here it was every evening, in his daily toils of surveying ended, that George, like a young Greek training for an Olympic Games, used to turn out with his sturdy young companions to see, as they termed it, which was the best man at jumping, running, and wrestling. And so keen was their passion for these sports, and so great their ambition to excel each other, that they would often persist, especially on moon-shining nights, till bedtime, meaning just nights at a full moon and they could see, not drinking moonshine. The Crawfords and Stensons, though not taller than George, were much heavier men, so that at wrestling, and particularly at the close or Indian hug, he seldom gained much matter of triumph. But in all trials of agility, they stood no chance with him. From these Frederick country gymnastics and exercises, they were allowed an effect which shows the very wide difference between participating in innocent and guilty pleasures. While companions in raking and gambling hardly despise or hate one another, and When they meet in the streets, pass each other's looks as cold and as shy as sheep-thieving curs. These virtuous young men, by spending their evening together with innocent and manly exercises, contracted a friendship in which lasted for life. When George, 25 years after this, was called to lead the American armies, he did not forget his old friends, the Stinsons and Crawfords, but gave commissions to all of them who chose to join his army, which several of them did. William Crawford, the eldest of them, and as brave a man as ever shouldered a musket, was advanced as high in rank as colonel, but when he was burnt to death by the Indians at Sandusky, and equally cordial was the love of these young men towards George, of whom they always spoke as a brother. Indeed, Hugh Stinson, the second brother, who had a way of snapping his eyes when he talked of anything that greatly pleased him, used to brighten up at the name of Washington, and would tell all his friends that he and his brother John had often laid with the conqueror of England on his back. At the same time, would agree that in running and jumping they were no match for him. Such was the way in which George spent his leisure hours in the service of Lord Fairfax. Little did the old gentleman expect that he was educating a youth who should one day dismember the British Empire and break his own heart, which truly came to pass. For on hearing that Washington had captured Cornwalls and in his army, called out to his black waiter, "Come, Joe, carry me to my bed, for I'm sure 'tis high time for me to die." Okay, yeah. Mm, that was interesting. I wouldn't really thought about it, but interesting story nonetheless. I don't hear much written about young George Washington, but that was an interesting story, and that was who did that one? That was written by Mason Locke Weems. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we got a poem. Yay. The Old Pioneer by Theodore O'Hara. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, knight-errant of the wood. Calmly beneath the green sod here, he rests from field and flood. The war whoop and the panther's screams no more shall his soul rouse. For well the aged hunter dreams beside his good old spouse. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, hushed now his rifle's peal. The dews of many a vanished year are in his rusted steel. His horn and pouch lie mouldering upon the cabin door. The elk rests by the salted spring, nor flees the fierce wild boar. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, old druid of the west. His offering was fleet wild deer, his shrine the mountain's crest. Oh, that was kind of cool. Oh, crap, it's still going. Within his wildwood temple's pace, an empire's towers nod. Where erst along with all his race, he knelt to nature's God. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, Columbus of the land, who guided freedom's proud career beyond the conquered stand, and gave her pilgrim sons a home no monarch's step profanes, free as the changeless winds that roam upon its boundless plains. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, the muffled drum resound, a warrior slumbering here beneath his battleground. For not alone with beast of prey the bloody strife he waged, foremost where the deadly fray of savage combat raged. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, a dirge for his old spouse, for her who blessed his forest cheer and kept his birchen house. Now soundly by her chieftain may the brave old dame sleep on. The red man's step is far away, the wolf's dread howl is gone. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, his pilgrimage is done. He hunts no more the grizzly bear about the setting sun. Weary at last of chase and life, he laid him here to rest. Nor recks he now what sport or strife would tempt him further west. A dirge for the brave old pioneer, the patriarch of his tribe. He sleeps, no pompous piles mark here, nor lions his deeds describe. They raised no stone above him here, nor carved his deathless name. An empire is his sculpture, his epitaph is fame. Cool. That really is good. Okay. And we go back into another story. I kind of like that poem, though. That's a cool poem. Ouch. So, the next story. George Washington Miller. I guess it's about being a miller. By Hanor A. Webb. No wheat has ever fallen under my observation that exceeds the wheat which some years ago I cultivated extensively. George Washington. George Washington of Virginia was a noted man even before the crisis in his country's welfare made him a noted general and the first president of a new nation. His reputation was as a farmer and stock raiser. He surprised his neighbors with new tools he bought, new plants he imported from Europe and elsewhere, the new methods of tilling soil. He was the first American farmer to rotate his crops, changing them from one field to another each successive year. He was the first American stock breeder to obtain jacks from Spain, breed them with the finest mares, and obtain their offspring, the first American mules. If they say so. One of Washington's chief crops for many years was tobacco, Virginia's pride. But about 1763, when he was 31, he became interested in wheat as a cash crop. The manner in which Washington acted upon his decision to become a wheat farmer was typical of his scientific mind. He planted all the different kinds of seed he could obtain to determine which gave the better yields. It was already known that some seeds yielded plants that would resist wheat diseases, such as smut and rust. And he kept close watch on his growing crops for those diseases. He tried different fertilizers in separate plots. He bought the newest tools for handling the wheat. To his overseer he wrote, "As I am never sparing, with proper economy, and furnishing my farms with every kind of tool and implement that is calculated to do good and neat work, I not only authorize you to bring the kinds of plows you are speaking to me about, but also the scythe and cradle different from those used with us, and with the grain is laid much better. I shall begrudge you no reasonable expense that will contribute to the improvement and neatness of my farms." That was my George Washington impersonation. Never heard of him before. Washington kept very careful records of everything he did on the farm, writing full report every day in his diary. He kept books to the last pound and penny. Although one of the wealthiest men in the land, he permitted no waste on the part of his employees. And business was good in Washington's wheat. In 1763, he had only 257.5 bushels to sell at 91 cents a bushel. After supplying his own household, But in 1769 he had 6,241.5 bushels for sale. Then he determined to become a miller as well as a grower of wheat. One flour mill was already in operation in the Mount Vernon estates, but it was small. A second mill was purchased at the 4-mile run near Alexandria, Virginia, the nearest city north of Mount Vernon. Washington, D.C. is now located across the Potomac River from Alexandria. Then he built a mill at Perryopolis, Pennsylvania, about 25 miles south of the present city of Pittsburgh. This was one of the first flour mills erected west of the Allegheny Mountains. Washington's mills ground 4 grades of flour. Most of it was superfine, and considered to be the best obtained in the region. This was because his wheat itself was the very best, due to his careful selection of seed and his methods of growing and harvesting. Washington kept several coopers busy making barrels, and the flour ground at the mills in Virginia was loaded on small schooners that came to Mount Vernon Wharf, and carried the filled barrels away to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. Okay, I did not know that about him. I knew he was a farmer, I just didn't know wheat, and I didn't really know that he went into milling too. But yeah. Though the stuff they were talking about George Washington on there about being the first farmer to rotate crops, I thought that was George Washington Carver, but I could be wrong. Oh well. And the next story, Early Settlers by John James Audubon. I think I see them harnessing their horses and attaching them to their wagons, which are already fitted with bedding provisions, and the younger children, while on their outside, are fastened spinning wheels and looms. A bucket filled with tar and tallow swings betwixt the hind wheels. Several axes are secured to the bolster, and the feeding trough for the horses contains pots, kettles, and pans. The servant now becomes the driver, riding the near saddled horse. The wife is mounted on the other. The worthy husband shoulders his gun, and his sons, clad in plaid, substantially homespun, drive the cattle ahead and lead the procession, followed by the hounds and the other dogs. Their day's journey is short and not agreeable. The cattle, stubborn or wild, frequently leave the road for the woods, giving the travelers much trouble. The harness of their horses here and there gives way. The immediate repair is needed. A basket which was accidentally dropped must be gone after, for nothing that they have can be spared. The roads are bad, and now they have all hands carried to push the wagon, or prevent it from upsetting. Yet, by sunset they have proceeded perhaps 20 miles. Fatigued, all assemble around the fire, which has been lighted. Supper is prepared, and the camp is being run up. There they pass the night. Days and weeks pass before they gain the end of their journey. They have crossed both the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. They have been traveling from the beginning of May to that of September, and with heavy hearts they traverse the neighborhood of the Mississippi. But now, arrived on the banks of the broad stream, they gaze in amazement on the deep, dark woods around them. Boats of various kinds they see gliding towards with the current, while others slowly ascend against it. A few inquiries are made at the nearest dwelling, and assisted by the inhabitants with their boats and canoes, they at once cross the river and select their place of habitation. The exhalations rising from the swamps and morasses around them have a powerful effect on the new settlers, but all are intent on preparing for winter. A small patch of ground is cleared by the axe, and a temporary cabin is erected. To each of the cattle is attached a bell before set loose in the neighboring canebrake, and the horses remain about the house, where they find sufficient food at the season. The first trading boat that stops at the land enables them to provide themselves with some flour, fish hooks, and ammunition, as well as other commodities. The looms are mounted, the spinning wheels soon furnish some yarn, and in a few weeks the family throw off their ragged clothes and array themselves in suits adapted for the climate. The father and sons, meanwhile, have sown turnips and other vegetables, and from some Kentucky flatboat a supply of live poultry has been purchased. October tinges the leaves of the forest. The morning dews are heavy, and the day is hot, and the nights chill, and the unacclimated family in the few days are attacked with ague. The lingering disease almost prostrates their whole faculties. Fortunately, the unhealthy season soon passes over, and their hoarfrosts made their appearance. Hoarfrosts. Gradually, each individual recovers strength. The largest ash trees are felled, their trunks are cut, split, and corded in front of the building. A large fire is lighted at night on the edge of the water, and soon a steamer calls to purchase the wood, and thus add to their comforts during the winter. This first fruit of their industry imparts new courage to them. Their exertions multiply, and when spring returns, the place has a cheerful look. Venison, bear's flesh, and turkey, ducks, and geese, and with so and now some fish, have served to keep up their strength, and now their engaged field is planted with corn, potatoes, and pumpkins. Their stock of cattle, too, has augmented. The steamer, which now stops here, as if by preference, buys a calf or pig together with their wood. Their store of provisions is renewed, and brighter rays of hope enliven their spirits. The sons discover a swamp covered with excellent timber, and as soon as they have seen many great rafts and saw logs bound for the sawmill to New Orleans, floating past rolling, they try to resolve the success of a little enterprise. A few cross saws are purchased, and some broad-wheeled carry logs are made of them. Log after log is hauled to the bank of the river, and in a short time their first raft is made on the shore and loaded with cordwood. When the next freshest sets will float, it is secured by long grapevines and cables until, the proper time being arrived, the husband and sons embark on it and float down the mighty stream. After encountering many difficulties, they arrive safely at New Orleans, where they dispose of their stock, the money obtained for which may be said by all profits. They supply themselves with such articles as they may, and their convenience and comforts, and with light hearts procure passage on the upper deck of a steamer at a very cheap rate, on account of the benefit of their labors in taking the wood and otherwise. Every successive year has increased to their savings. Now they possess a large stock of horses, cows, hogs, an abundance of provisions, and domestic comforts of every kind. The daughters have been married to the sons of neighboring squatters, and have gained sisters to themselves and marriage of their brothers. Now this next one could be interesting. The Invention of the Cotton Gin by Eliza F. Andrews. Eli Whitney, at the time of inventing the cotton gin, was a guest at Mulberry Grove, near Savannah, Georgia, at the home of General Nathaniel Greene, of Revolutionary fame. After the death of the general, his widow married Phineas Miller, tutor to General Greene's children, and a friend and college mate of the Whitneys. The ingenuity of the Yankee visitor, as exhibited in various amateur devices and tinkerings about the premises, inspired the family with such confidence in his skill that, on one occasion, when Mrs. Miller's watch was out of order, she gave it to Mr. Whitney to repair. no professional watchmaker being within reach. Not long thereafter, a gentleman called at the house to exhibit a fine sample of cotton wool, and incidentally remarked while displaying the sample, "There is a fortune in store for someone who will invent a machine for separating the lint from the seed." Mrs. Miller, who was present, turned to Whitney and said, "You are the very man, Mr. Whitney, for since you succeeded so well with my watch, I am sure you have the ingenuity enough to make the machine." After some conversation, Mr. Whitney confined himself closely to his room for several weeks. At the end of this time, he invited the family to inspect his model for the cotton gin. It was constructed with wire teeth and a revolving cylinder. However, there was no conveyance for throwing off the lint after it was separated from the seed, and it wrapped around the cylinder, thereby greatly obstructing its operation. Mrs. Miller, seeing the difficulty, seized a common clothes brush, applied it with the teeth, and caught the lint. Whitney, with delight, exclaimed, "Madam, you have solved the problem. With this suggestion, my machine is complete." The important part of this played by a woman in the history of the cotton gin is unknown. I believe, except as family tradition, even in her own state. My father was also informed by a gentleman who connected Whitney with a business that later obtained the first idea of the invention from a machine used to prepare rags for making paper, which he saw on a wrecked vessel. Unfortunately for Mr. Whitney, the prediction with regard whether the fortune in store for the future inventor of the cotton gin was not realized, for he was engaged with constant lawsuits against infringement for his patent rights, and lived and died poor. As a Georgian, I regret to say that his adopted state has never bestowed any substantial token of appreciation upon the inventor of the machine by which he was so largely profited. Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina manifested their appreciation of his merits by substantial donations, while Georgia, with sorrow I write it, has been worse than silent, for her juries refused him verdicts in which the judges declared him entitled against the violators of his patent. So uncertain was the enforcement of the patent laws in those days that Whitney resorted to the same expedients for the protection of his rights in medieval times used to invite charges of sorcery and witchcraft. I mean, the expedients of secrecy. About the year 1794 or 1795, Whitney established a ginnery on the Smyrna, about 6 miles from Washington in Wilkes County, Georgia. This was one of the first, if not the very first, cotton gin ever worked in the state. Together with his partner, a man named Durfee, he erected at this place a large cotton storehouse, which now does service a barn belonging to Mrs. Tom Burdett. The gin house had narrowed grated windows so that visitors might stand outside and watch the cotton flying from the gin without observing the operation of the machine, which was concealed behind a lower screen. On the occasion of the militia muster of the neighborhood, a rustic battalion was permitted to file through the house, while Whitney's gin was in operation, and see the flakes of cotton thrown off by the brushes, but no one was allowed to examine further. Women were permitted by Whitney to enter his gin and examine the machine, if they liked, if they were not supposed to be capable of betraying the secret to the builders, an opinion for which modern females of the strong-minded school will no doubt bear him a grudge, and not altogether without reason when he considered the material assistance he received from the woman in perfecting his invention. This fact of the free admission for women was used to advantage Edward Lyon, a smooth-faced young resident at a distance, to gain admission to Whitney's establishment disguised in female attire. He communicated the secret to his brother John, who immediately set to work and produced his improvements on Whitney's invention, and in shape of the modern saw gin. The saw was made for him by Billy McFerrin, an Irish blacksmith in Wilkes County, who died some 25 or 30 years ago. This was the first gin he ever made. The saws were constructed in semicircles and fastened around the cylinders in pairs, so as to form complete circles when finished. As early as 1797, a gin factory was established in Georgia by a man named McLeod, and Whitney's lawsuits against him were unsuccessful. The old gentleman who purchased the gin from McLeod told my father years later that even when it worked as well as new, it was propelled by water. Gin 2,500 pounds of cottonseed per day. Previous to this, a gin in ordinary use was an arrangement of two wooden rollers revolving in the opposite direction, which preceded Mr. Whitney's invention. It was worked by hand and ginned only from 75 to 100 pounds per day, and the man had to be constantly employed turning the rollers, and the friction burnt out so fast. This machine is still used for ginning the best qualities of Sea Island cotton, the advantage being that it does not cut the staple as the saw gins do. The honor of having invented the first cotton gin is sometimes disputed with Eli Whitney in favor of Mr. Bull, a gentleman from Baltimore who settled in Columbia County, Georgia, and introduced the saw gin in 1795. The first used perpendicular saws, but afterwards changed into circular ones with the imitation, no doubt, of Whitney and Lyon. Mr. Bull was an enterprising and ingenious man, and was the first to introduce iron packing screws to his state. Costing from 1500 to 1800, these were so expensive that they were soon abandoned for the common wooden screw, now in general use on plantations. His invention of the perpendicular saw gin was, there seems to be no doubt, independent of Whitney's, though posterior to it, the latter having come into operation in 1793. Thus, though Eli Whitney failed to realize the profits of his invention, it seems clear that he must be left in undisputed possession of at least the barren bones. Ugh. I apologize for me constantly switching to a southern accent when I'm reading these stories, but it just seems to be the way that they feel written. And, it does kind of seem that they were written for the southern persuasion, and as such, I must read them thusly. That's almost at the 2 hour mark, so I've looked at the next story, and it's a lot longer. I do like to keep these reading things at 2 hours, so. So I hope everyone liked my bad accents, and reckon you can deal with those kind of things on it. Let's see who all might be on that we can do a little raid on. Oh, damn, excuse me. Okay, no more accents, if I can deal with it. Oh, man. If anyone has any suggestions on who to raid, by all means, feel free to toss them up. Really? Oh. Let's see. must have just started streaming. Does anyone else on my reading list? Let's see. Anyone? Suggestions? Let's see. Dustin was playing the kitty cat game, which I have to admit I did get, and it's not something I feel like I could stream because I'd be too busy just playing with a cat. Let's see. Hang on. No, what? Dang it. Kale was already off. I would raid him if he was still on, because... Oh. I'm the one doing story time right now. Let's see. He just started. Oh, what? No hearing. Oh, okay. What's on? Oh, okay. I keep forgetting I have it set up so I can hear audio on other channels and whatnot. Anyone who's not affiliated yet? Man, it takes so long for these pages to load. Let's see. Okay. Okay, don't do a kitty cat raid. Okay. So, I'm going to use that raid message if you guys are up for it. If you're here. There's so many people playing Stray right now. So many people playing cat game. No. Let's go ahead and read Dusk. Can you move? No, no. Maybe not. Just got fewer people right now. Oh, thanks for coming by, Gary. Let's see. Anyone I want to raid? Oh, that's not even on. So what do you think of the stories, or how many of them did you hear? As it says that the southern stories have a definite tilt to them. Yes, you're gone. I guess we won't do a kitty cat raid. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the Echoes of the Southland, they were written Civil War era, so language is, you know, for that time period. I mean, there was one that actually described that the Anglo-Saxon race was going to be the one leading into the next century. And from what I could tell, that was actually going to be part of a speech given at a college. It was like one phrase of it just kind of kept sticking out to me, and then let's see if I can find it again. Torch things called Torch of Civilization, but the line that bothered me was, uh, I believe, the great Anglo-Saxon race, not only on the other side of the water, but on this side of the water. And when I say Anglo-Saxon race, I mean the great white English-speaking race. And I use the other term here because none more satisfactory to me. I mean, that's just, damn. That's just cringeworthy to say. Yeah. But that was apparently from a speech given at a college. But I could not find the year. The speech was the Torch of Civilization. And where is it? It was by Thomas Nelson Page. But, yeah. The fact he had to explain which race he was talking about is kind of sad. I said, I apologize every time I do the Southern readings. This is, as much as it bothers me, I know it would bother other people. I'd say in some of the literature section of this book, it's actually going to get into a little bit harsher stories. Because, let's see. See, we stopped at the invention of cotton gin. The next one's going to be about a sugar crop. One here called Primus Gets His Freedom. One of them is going to be really fun for me to read, called The Old Time Darky, followed by Eulogy of Flacco, Chief of the Liptons. But the thing is, I'm not going to censor history because people need to know it. It is Primus, not Primate. But things like the Primus Gets His Freedom, The Old Time Darky, Eulogy of Flacco, the White-Faced Bumblebee, Uncle Gabe's Mule, see, Uncle Remus at the Telephone. Yeah, cringeworthy stuff. Willie the Warden? Huh? Don't think I've seen that one anywhere. Ah, okay. Man, I wish I could get past this cough. Talking about pond waters and singing in a family reunion. I wanted to move my camera to the other side of my computer. I'm gonna have to look that up. Ah, okay. Ouch. It's on Canadian TV? That's WCAU TV. In Philadelphia. Okay. Let's see what's going on with Fuss about. It doesn't say anything about you being here yet. Okay, I think that's one I did an update. Okay, that should work. Let's see, will it trigger? And yeah, it triggered. Okay. I need to fix that. But I'll do that later. So what art have you been working on? I guess I could have it linked to an art page instead of a channel shutout. You haven't done much. Why not? Oh. No. That's unless you have like commissions going on. You can take your time anyway, because art happens when art happens. Oh yeah, I know all about that. Of course, I wish I could do art at all, because my art is... I'm more a storyteller than an artist. I'm doing good color between lines most of the time. Yeah, any art's good, really. Everyone likes funny art, too. I'm tinkering with code stuff. Just because I can occasionally. Alright. Have a good night, Gurry. So, next time you come in, they may have a different message pop up for you when you pop in. Provided it works. Let's see. Okay. Save. Okay. I wonder if it'll work. I wonder when we'll find out. Oh, come on. Oh, we forgot to save on them. Pretty sure I have it coded right. Ah, there we go. I had way too much fun since I found out how to do that. No, if you yell at me, I'll disable it. So. I'm not seeing a reaction yet. Did you run away already? We have to wait until next time to see it? Man. Oh, well. Man. Okay. I'm gonna go to Red Dusk. Alright, so switch to my closing screen, wherever it is. There it is. Yeah. I'm glad everyone came by. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Yada yada yada. Okay, let's go watch Kitty Cats. Good night.